Archaeological teams and archival remembrancers who have combed the palace archives and rediscovered damaged pict feed sequences record the opening hours of the final civil war with a stubborn preference for raw, verifiable signals over legend. Fragmented transmissions recovered from orbital relay buoys show the first coherent pattern. Long-range salvos and missile barrages designed to test and then overwhelm the outer solar defences. Surface sensors that survived the bombardment registered the initial impacts as a concentrated campaign of symbolic and military strikes aimed at key command nodes and the Imperial Palace's outer bastions. Those fragments remain patchy. Where one relay failed, another preserved the cadence of fireworks and counterfire, producing a composite record that frames the siege not as a single moment of collapse, but as the culmination of decades of political decay, doctrinal fracture, and clandestine corruption that had been gathering since the Great Crusade. The evidence from those pick feeds, the burn patterns on terraformed terraces outside the palace, and the logged testimony of surviving defense commanders together form the primary corpus for modern reconstructions of the event, the Siege of Terra. The immediate cause of the siege is traceable to a larger sequence of betrayal and escalation that began years before the first shot fell. Horus Lupercal's fall to the ruinous powers and the conspiracies he fostered among several Space Marine legions sowed the seeds of open rebellion across the Imperium's military hierarchy. The treachery that crystallized into the Horus Heresy altered the strategic balance of the galaxy. A significant portion of the Astartes, elements of the Imperial fleet, and legions of allied warhosts turned against the Emperor's designs, creating a rival force capable of projecting power into the solar system. That shift converted political rupture into kinetic reality. What might otherwise have remained a contest of propaganda and subterfuge became a coordinated campaign aimed at the heart of imperial authority. Modern historiography treats the siege as the expected outcome once Horus secured sufficient naval and mechanized assets to threaten Terra itself, a trajectory confirmed by strategic logs and the sequence of novels that document the military buildup and the solar war that preceded the final assault. The operational opening of the Siege of Terra occurred as a combined void and surface operation. From orbit, the Warmaster's fleet subjected Terra's orbital defences to an extended and brutal campaign intended to neutralise interdiction arrays and degrade supply links to the palace. Surface commanders recorded that the bombardment began with coordinated barrages aimed at communication relays, orbital docks, and the defensive ringworks that fed the planetary shields. The objective was tactical and symbolic, to isolate the palace physically while eroding the psychological integrity of its defenders. Loyalist fleet elements contested the approach in the solar system, producing days of fleet actions and interdictions that consumed warships and fuel reserves on both sides. Contemporary reconstructions indicate the void phase lasted multiple solar cycles, with command logs referencing sustained engagements that bought time for ground forces to maneuver and for the planetary bastions to prepare. The tenor of those engagements is preserved in both the recovered tactical logs and the accounts compiled by later chroniclers who gathered testimony from fleet captains and survivors. Strategically, Horus's plan combined attrition against orbital defences with the projection of mechanized and airmobile forces aimed at breaching the outer defensive belts of the palace. The Loyalists, by contrast, concentrated on maintaining the integrity of the Aegis system and fortifying the bastions that ring the Imperial Palace. The balance between siege artillery and rapid strike elements defined the opening weeks, as the Warmaster sought to neutralise long-range counter-battery assets while inserting specialised assault cadres to seize key landings and gatehouses. The result was a measured multi-domain confrontation rather than a single decisive clash. The battle for Terra unfolded as a concatenation of deliberate strikes, sabotage, and attritional clashes across both orbital and terrestrial theatres. Secondary effects: disrupted civilian logistics, the collapse of regional governance networks, and the overwhelmed medical facilities within the lower tiers of the palace amplified the military crisis into a broader humanitarian and administrative catastrophe. The political causes that enabled the siege are as consequential as the immediate military calculations. Years of doctrinal divergence, religious ferment, and institutional erosion within the Imperium's governing bodies left gaps that Horus's conspirators exploited. The civil rupture was not solely the product of a single traitor's ambition. It involved failures in intelligence, a culture of deference to charismatic commanders, and the emergence of cultic movements that reframed loyalty as orthodoxy rather than civic duty. Those ideological fissures transformed tactical disagreements into existential schisms. Administrative negligence in several frontier sectors allowed the rebels to consolidate resources and find safe harbours, while the Emperor's absence from the public stages of governance created an opening for alternative authorities to claim legitimacy. Modern analyses treat these causes as cumulative. The siege manifested because the Imperium's internal cohesion had been incrementally degraded, and when a capable and ruthless adversary seized that vulnerability, the trajectory toward a planetary assault became tragically predictable. A closer examination of the early tactical phases reveals the interplay between technology and human decision-making. Siege weapons and long-range bombardment platforms played a central role, but so did human factors: miscommunication, the misallocation of reserve forces, and the moral and psychological strain on units tasked with defending the palace's immediate perimeters. The palace itself, an accumulation of successive defensive architectures, presented a layered problem for both attacker and defender. Its outer wards afforded approach corridors reconnoitred long before the Warmaster's final mobilization. Inner sanctums relied on redundant systems and veteran guard formations that had been trained for protracted defense rather than sudden, coordinated infiltration. Those structural realities shaped tactical choices. Horus's forces preferred a strategy of multi-point pressure to force the defenders to thin their lines, while Loyalist commanders consolidated their most reliable formations around the palace's core to prevent a catastrophic collapse. This dynamic, pressure and consolidation, governed the initial weeks and defined the tactical environment in which later pitched battles would occur. From the perspective of material culture, the siege exposed the limits of Imperial logistics and the vulnerabilities inherent to suprastationary installations. Supply manifests recovered from Loyalist depots show that the planetary defenders were engineered for maintenance cycles, not for prolonged high-intensity urban combat. Armoured regiments and artillery batteries were present in numbers sufficient to repel common threats, but the scale of the Warmaster's combined arms doctrine, integrating demonically augmented units, mechanized legions and aerial insertion forces, overstretched those preparations. Conversely, traitor forces demonstrated an advantage in adaptive supply chaining, having secured pre-positioned caches and captured orbital platforms that allowed them to sustain a long campaign without the same degree of exposure. The logistics analysis underscores a larger methodological point. In reconstructing the siege, material remnants, munitions types, fuel signatures, repair logs provide as clear a causal narrative as the surviving human testimonies. Eyewitness fragments and later depositions provide a complementary human-scale view of the opening days. Remembrances and surviving palace staff describe the first bombardments as a series of escalating shocks, each aimed to compel a different reaction. The initial volleys attempted to blind long-range sensors, subsequent barrages sought to cripple railheads, and precision strikes targeted orbital landing clamps. Civilians and lower-tier servitors recorded nights of red fire and the constant vibration of distant impacts, details that did not influence strategy but shaped morale. Officers who later provided testimony emphasized the strain of command decisions made under incomplete information. Reserves committed to counterattacks that were then rerouted by command interference, and reconnaissance reports that arrived too late to prevent local collapses. Those human elements, delay, misjudgment, improvisation, do not alter the broad structural narrative, but they illuminate how contingency and the fog of war shaped the precise course of the siege's initial phase. Scholars reconstructing the event place strong emphasis on chronology because the sequence of attacks determined the strategic options available to both sides. The initial orbital phase, followed by coordinated ground insertions, forced defenders into a pattern of reaction. Where the Loyalists successfully contained thrusts, they bought time to reposition reserves and repair infrastructure. Where they failed, Horus's forces exploited breaches to open corridors for mechanized spearheads and airborne assaults. The cumulative tempo, the rhythm of salvo, counter-salvo, insertion, and consolidation, produced attrition that progressively eroded defensive depth. That erosion, measured in lost fortifications, depleted ammunition stores, and exhausted personnel, set the conditions for the deeper operations that would define the siege's middle and late phases. Contemporary chronologies constructed from fleet logs, citadel dispatches, and picked feed recoveries provide the skeleton for these analyses, allowing historians to align disparate testimonies into a coherent temporal map. In sum, the opening of the Siege of Terra combines clear, tangible triggers with a web of structural causes. It was an event precipitated by deliberate military planning and enabled by decades of political and institutional failure. The evidence set, archaeological fragments, picked feed composites, fleet and garrison logs, and survivor testimony, supports a reconstruction in which the siege was neither inevitable in a deterministic sense, nor avoidable given the choices then on offer. Instead, it stands as the logical, if catastrophic, consequence of the intersection between ambition, betrayal, and systemic weakness. Subsequent parts of this account will examine the forces that engaged in the siege, the nature of their first encounters on the palace approaches, and the episodes of direct hostility that defined the early ground campaigns. The forces drawn into the Siege of Terra represented the most extensive concentration of military power ever assembled within the Imperium's cradle. Modern reconstructions identify the Loyalist coalition as a composite of veteran formations that had survived the galaxy-wide civil war. Imperial Fists under Rogel Dawn formed the core of the defensive command, supported by the White Scars who had broken through hostile blockade lines during the Solar War. Later records confirm that a significant detachment of Blood Angels arrived under Sanguinius after navigating the tumult of the Ruin Storm. These three Space Marine legions, combined with the Custodian Guard, the Sisters of Silence, and regiments of the Imperial Army, formed the foundation of the defense. Across the opposing line stood the Traitor Legions, each bringing specialized methods of warfare sharpened by years of fratricide. Sons of Horus served as the strategic and symbolic spearhead of the attack, while the Death Guard, World Eaters, and Emperor's Children each contributed forces shaped by their own corruptions and altered doctrines. The Iron Warriors, long familiar with siegecraft, played a major role in coordinating assaults against the palace's fortifications. The Thousand Suns appeared only in fragmented, warp-distorted accounts, entering battle when the tides of the Imperium aligned with their patronage. The Wordbearers, Night Lords, Alpha Legion, and Dark Mechanicum elements completed the roster of rebel forces that pressed into the solar system. The Loyalist side relied heavily on the disciplined, methodical structure of the Imperial Fists. Their experience in fortification engineering, counter-siege operations, and large-scale defensive logistics allowed them to assume the immediate responsibility of reinforcing the palace's outer lines. They were joined by the towering Custodian Guard, whose role was to provide rapid, high-impact responses to threats that breached or bypassed fixed defenses. The Sisters of Silence offered a unique strategic advantage, projecting null fields that interfered with demonic entities and psyche-dependent tactics. They formed screening detachments around key points where Loyalist command believed warp breaches were likely. The Imperial Army supplied the massed manpower required to hold trenches, maintain supply corridors, and support the Space Marines in block-to-block fighting. Although many regiments had been battered by years of internal war, they provided crucial endurance and depth to the defensive lines. These human forces, described in later studies as the breathing infrastructure of the siege, absorbed the majority of the attrition inflicted during the early fighting. The Traitor Legions contrasted sharply with the Loyalists. Their forces were numerically larger, but the most significant difference lay in their altered doctrines. The Death Guard advanced under the leadership of Mortarion, with an emphasis on attrition warfare, advancing through toxic bombardment and persistent infantry waves that ignored terrain and weather constraints. The World Eaters employed relentless close assault methods that disregarded casualty rates entirely, forming shock elements intended to overwhelm fixed positions. The Emperor's Children, under Fulgrim, used noise-based disruption tactics and psychologically destabilizing assaults designed to degrade the discipline of defenders. The Iron Warriors, commanded by Perturabo, shaped the broad siege strategy on Horus's behalf. Their engineering units established mobile artillery platforms, siege towers, and staged forward bastions that extended firing lines closer to the palace. Under their guidance, the Traitor advance relied on incremental pressure rather than pure brute force, even if other legions deviated from this approach in local assaults. The presence of the Mechanicum further complicated the picture. The Loyalists retained access to loyal forge worlds and naval yards capable of supplying munitions and conducting repairs within the palace walls. The rebels countered with the Dark Mechanicum, whose demonic war machines and corrupted engines enabled assaults that Loyalist tacticians struggled to categorize. Many early encounters with these engines became the subject of later tech studies, as their hybrid designs blended conventional technology with warp-borne properties. When both coalitions finally collided on Terra's surface, the first encounters were shaped by the geography of the palace itself. The outer defences stretched across interlocked curtain walls, gate complexes, towers and trench networks designed across millennia. Each layer presented choke points that forced the attackers into predictable lanes of approach. The initial clashes therefore presented a pattern of reconnaissance in strength, in which traitor spearheads probed the defences to determine firing arcs and response times. One of the earliest documented engagements involved Sons of Horus assault cadres advancing across the plains surrounding the Saturnine Gate. Pictfeed reconstructions show these units operating in coordinated formations, supported by fast-moving armour. The defenders, composed of Imperial Fists heavy weapon teams reinforced by army infantry, responded with disciplined volleys that forced the attackers to withdraw. Even in those first moments, patterns emerged that would define the siege. The Loyalists fought with precision and cohesion, while the Traitors applied pressure through repeated, escalating assaults that tested the limits of Loyalist endurance. Near the Ultimate Gate, Blood Angel's forces encountered the first coordinated push by the Emperor's Children. Contemporary research notes that this engagement revealed substantial changes within the Emperor's Children Legion, as their units displayed inconsistent discipline, erratic advance patterns, and sensory-based weaponry that produced harmful sonic resonance. The Blood Angels responded by forming tight defensive knots along the approach paths, demonstrating their ability to adapt to unorthodox tactics. These early exchanges showed that the siege would not be defined solely by artillery and static lines. It would incorporate unpredictable behavioural elements shaped by corruption and mutation among the rebel forces. As these first engagements concluded, the traitor commanders adjusted their battle rhythms. They recognised that probing attacks alone could not fracture the palace's outer layers, so they prepared for larger coordinated assaults that integrated artillery, mechanised units, and infantry waves. This shift marked the transition from reconnaissance to deliberate hostility. At the same time, Loyalist commanders shifted their own approach, deploying reserves to positions where they anticipated heavier pressure. The opening phase therefore established a dynamic pattern of action and reaction, each influencing the other. The first major hostile encounters began when the Iron Warriors activated their long-range siege platforms. These engines delivered sustained bombardment against critical defense towers, pushing the first defenders into forced withdrawals. In response, the Imperial Fist coordinated counter-battery fire from concealed emplacements built into the palace's older foundations. This retaliatory effort slowed the traitor advance, but it did not halt it. Both sides recorded significant material losses, a pattern that persisted throughout the siege. The World Eaters initiated their first large-scale assault shortly after the Iron Warriors' bombardment opened corridors in the defensive lines. These berserkers launched direct charges across open ground that should have resulted in catastrophic casualties. However, the sheer intensity of their momentum allowed them to reach trench systems and breach them in several locations. In these moments, the Custodian Guard intervened. Their arrival at breached segments stabilized the lines, though at significant cost. The nature of these encounters demonstrated that even the most elite Loyalist forces could not maintain a static defense without risk of collapse. The Death Guard followed with methodical infantry pushes supported by chemical bombardments. Their approach differed from the World Eaters, relying on sustained pressure rather than sudden aggression. Their resilience created prolonged engagements along the northern spans of the palace walls, forcing defenders to rotate units to prevent exhaustion. Environmental conditions deteriorated as chemical munitions altered air quality, reducing visibility and causing respiratory strain among human regiments. These developments contributed to the classification of this phase as one of the most physically taxing segments of the early siege. There were additional hostile encounters that shifted local balances of power. The Emperor's children continued to launch disruptive raids that targeted morale. Sons of Horus assault cadres maintained pressure along central corridors, attempting to create footholds that could be exploited later. The Night Lords conducted infiltration strikes that sought to sabotage communications. The Wordbearers used ritual formations that produced warp disturbances, prompting rapid deployment of Sisters of Silence units to nullify those effects. Each clash added layers of complexity to the siege. No single encounter determined the outcome, yet each shaped the defenders' understanding of the scale of the threat. Loyalist leadership recognized that the traitors were willing to expend vast resources in pursuit of breach points. They also recognized that the rebel forces were prepared to synchronize their diverse methods, combining attrition, terror, infiltration, corruption, and overwhelming violence. These opening battles revealed the central reality of the Siege of Terra. The defenders were outnumbered, isolated, and confronted by an enemy that had abandoned restraint. Despite this, they held the lines through discipline, coordination, and the strategic advantage of fortified terrain. The result was a stalemate defined by constant violence, in which momentum shifted repeatedly from hour to hour. As the first hostile encounters settled into broader operations, the palace's outer defences remained intact, though weakened. The Traitor Legions continued to prepare for deeper incursions. The Loyalists recalibrated their dispositions. The stage was set for the next phase of the siege, in which larger battles, more destructive weapons, and increasingly desperate measures would reshape the conflict. The final phase of the Siege of Terra began when the defensive network around the Imperial Palace reached a condition that later archivists classified as structurally compromised but not yet fully breached beyond recovery. The ongoing assaults had pushed the Loyalists into successive fallback zones, each one designed as a controlled withdrawal to preserve cohesion. Despite this order, the defenders experienced extreme pressure as several walls, bastions, and approach corridors sustained irreversible damage. Imperial army formations were reduced to fragmented clusters holding isolated strongpoints, while Space Marine contingents were rotated continuously to prevent complete attrition. Reports from medical stations indicate that casualty levels had exceeded sustainable thresholds, but the command structure required all forces capable of movement to remain on the lines. The rebel advance intensified when Horus altered his strategy. Instead of relying solely on broad frontal pressure, he initiated precision assaults aimed at exploiting weakened areas. The Iron Warriors coordinated heavy artillery barrages that dismantled several remaining battlements. Sons of Horus spearheads moved immediately behind the bombardments to capitalize on disrupted formations. The combination of targeted fire and rapid follow-through forced the defenders to abandon several exterior districts within the palace perimeter. These losses marked the moment when the siege transitioned from a predominantly defensive contest to a series of desperate internal engagements within the palace precincts. The Lion's Gate spaceport became one of the most significant losses. Its fall allowed traitor forces to establish a staging ground that brought their heavy assets closer to the palace interior. The loss also removed a logistical lifeline, further restricting Loyalist movement and resupply. The White Scars mounted repeated counterattacks to delay the collapse of the area, but they were outmatched by the concentrated pressure from Night Lords and Sons of Horus units. The fall of the spaceport became an irreversible shift that accelerated the movement of rebel forces toward the inner walls. The Saturnine Gate, defended primarily by the Imperial Fists, experienced one of the most notable turning points when the Sons of Horus attempted a breakthrough that nearly reached the internal structures of the Saturnine complex. Archival analyses emphasize that this engagement demonstrated the defenders' adaptability. The Imperial Fist redirected resources from adjacent fronts to reinforce the threatened corridor, halting the rebel advance after extended close-quarters combat. This action preserved a critical sector of the palace, preventing a breach that would have allowed a faster collapse of the Loyalist defense. However, the effort consumed reserve units that would not be replaced. As these internal battles progressed, command decisions were shaped by the expectation that Horus's fleet in orbit maintained overwhelming superiority. The Loyalist naval screen had been reduced to scattered remnants after the Solar War, leaving Terra vulnerable to bombardment if the traitors chose to resume orbital attacks. The primary reason such bombardments were not renewed was the presence of the Emperor aboard the palace. Horus sought to confront him directly and avoid destroying the objective he intended to claim. This strategic restraint preserved Terra's surface, but prolonged the suffering of its defenders. The closing sequence of the siege was initiated by an event preserved in all major sources. Horus disabled the shields protecting his flagship and invited the Emperor to board. The reasons for this action remain the subject of later theoretical discussion, but the direct consequence is well established. The Emperor, accompanied by select warriors including Sanguinius and Rogel Dawn, teleported to the flagship. The process was disrupted, scattering individuals into different sectors of the vessel. Within these fragmented engagements, Sanguinius confronted Horus alone and was killed. While the duel between the Emperor and Horus represents the decisive conclusion of the heresy, the narrative function of these events within the context of the siege is clear. Once Horus was killed, the cohesion of the Traitor Legions collapsed. Without their Warmaster, their chain of command dissolved rapidly. The Sons of Horus were the first to break, followed by the Emperor's children and the World Eaters. Some traitor forces attempted to maintain organized resistance, particularly the Iron Warriors, but they were unable to sustain pressure against re-empowered Loyalist counterattacks. The defenders, whose strength had nearly reached exhaustion, initiated a coordinated push once the news of the Warmaster's death spread across the battlefield. Survivor testimonies indicate that some traitor units abandoned their positions immediately, while others continued fighting without strategic direction. The Custodian Guard and Imperial Fists exploited these fractures, driving the attackers away from the palace's inner walls. In several districts, Loyalist forces found abandoned artillery, destroyed supply caches, and evidence of internal conflict among rebel ranks. These details support later conclusions that morale within the Traitor Legions had deteriorated rapidly. The closing of the event is therefore characterized by a sudden reversal. Months of incremental rebel advancement were undone within a short period once leadership at the highest level was removed. The Loyalists regained control of the palace districts, re-established defensive grids, and secured wounded survivors. The Traitor Legions withdrew from Terra entirely, using whatever ships remained capable of warp travel. Many of these fleeing forces later fragmented into warbands that would become the earliest identifiable groups within what modern sources classify as the forces of chaos. The overall result of the Siege of Terra was preservation of the Imperium's foundational structures, but at extraordinary cost. The Emperor was critically wounded and placed upon the Golden Throne, where he remains. Sanguinius was killed, and the Blood Angels underwent profound changes in the aftermath. The Imperial Fists endured extreme losses, but retained enough structure to execute the rebuilding efforts demanded in the years following the siege. The White Scars remained one of the few legions to emerge with their autonomy largely intact. Terra itself was scarred, depopulated in several districts, and dependent on massive reconstruction that would occupy the remaining millennia. From a strategic perspective, the siege demonstrated several key findings that later military studies used to explain the durability of the Imperium. The first is that Terra's defences, even when partially compromised, were capable of delaying overwhelming force long enough for internal strategic events to shape the outcome. The second is that legionary cohesion, whether loyal or traitor, depended heavily on the presence and stability of leadership at the Primarch level. When Horus died, the Traitor Legions lacked the organizational resilience to continue unified operations. Another finding concerns the role of specialized forces. The presence of the Custodian Guard and Sisters of Silence created unique battlefield advantages that counterbalanced the corruptions and warp-based tactics introduced by the rebel forces. The Custodians' ability to operate independently within fragmented corridors prevented several early collapses of defensive lines. The Sisters of Silence neutralized warp anomalies that might have otherwise allowed demonic intrusion on a wider scale. Their deployment validated long-standing strategic doctrines regarding the use of anti-psyker units in large-scale engagements. The siege also revealed significant changes within the Traitor Legions. Their reliance on warp influence, demonic augmentation, and unstable weapon systems produced short-term advantages at the expense of long-term sustainability. This instability contributed to their sudden collapse once central leadership was eliminated. Later studies classify this as an early demonstration of the inherent volatility of chaos-aligned forces, which continue to show similar patterns across millennia. The environmental impact of the siege also became a key analytical area. Chemical bombardments from the Death Guard altered local atmospheres, requiring extensive reclamation in subsequent centuries. Structural damage across the palace's outer districts resulted in long-term reconstruction projects. The logistical demands of the siege revealed weaknesses in supply routes between Terra and the wider Imperium, prompting reforms in fleet composition and administrative oversight once the new era began. From a socio-political perspective, the siege transformed the Imperium into a more rigid and defensive entity. The establishment of the High Lords, the restructuring of the Space Marine Legions into chapters, and the codification of doctrine surrounding psyker control were all consequences rooted in the trauma of the siege. Without these events, the post-heresy Imperium would not resemble its current form. The final key finding concerns the nature of warfare during the heresy era. The Siege of Terra demonstrated that technological, psychic, and conventional forces could interact in ways that created unpredictable outcomes. The defenders managed to endure because of their ability to adapt quickly to conditions shaped by corrupted technology, warp manifestations, and sudden tactical shifts. This adaptability became one of the defining characteristics of Imperial warfare in subsequent ages. Ultimately, the closing of the Siege of Terra represents the pivotal point at which the Imperium survived, but at the cost of becoming permanently changed. The Loyalists held the palace, drove off the Traitor Legions, and preserved the administrative heart of the Imperium. Yet the victory created a future marked by constant vigilance, militarization, and dependence on institutions born directly from the losses endured during the siege. The records maintained by the Adeptus Administratum concerning the Siege of Terra are shaped less by emotion and far more by the cold pressure of necessity. For an institution that measures its life in millennia rather than generations, the siege did not represent a single catastrophe, but an unbroken sequence of operational failures, enforced adaptations, and emergency reallocations. Their internal assessments describe the event not as a battle for survival, though it certainly was, but as a total systemic overload where every long-established process was pushed beyond its tolerances. Administratum clerks documented how requisition orders, which normally flowed through layered chains of approval, were reduced to localized authorizations that bypassed decades-old bureaucracy, simply because the alternative was collapse. Countless sigil-stamped forms prepared through ritual and protocol were abandoned in favor of raw operational directives etched directly into data slate memory logs. For the Administratum, the siege was an economic and logistical shockwave, a moment where supply chains broke faster than they could be reinforced, and where the predictive models they relied on failed to anticipate the sheer ferocity of the Warmaster's advance. The earliest Administratum impressions highlight the failure of outer defense projections. Their historical audits show that the numbers originally assigned to Terra's defense scenario were built on outdated threat assessments, many still rooted in the pre-heresy assumption that no Imperial Legion would ever willingly turn its guns on the cradle of mankind. When the traitor host committed to a full invasion, the Administratum's primary analytics engines, vast cogitator clusters layered beneath the palace precincts, flagged the event as a statistical impossibility even while the fleets were already burning their way into the system. This mismatch between expectation and reality left the Administratum struggling to adapt, forcing them to reconfigure supply priorities on the fly. Construction labour previously earmarked for civilian maintenance was immediately reassigned to fortification reinforcement, and entire regiments awaiting deployment to other war zones were grounded permanently to form emergency defensive cohorts. According to their after-action projections, these emergency reassignments preserved a measurable degree of stability across the palace interior, but they also accelerated the collapse of outlying precincts that no longer had the manpower to maintain proper discipline or guard rotation. Parallel to this, the Adeptus Mechanicus logged their own impressions in a vastly different format. Where the Administratum saw a failure of process, the Mechanicus perceived a monumental test of infrastructure under duress. Their archives describe how every macro generator, plasma gate, communication spine, and internal conduit was pushed into redline output levels not seen since the dark age of technology. Machine spirits that had grown accustomed to slow, ritualized cycles were forced into continuous operation, and many failed in ways the tech priests had no record of diagnosing. Mechanicus reports reveal that half of the early casualties among their own members came not from enemy fire but from catastrophic system overloads, detonating power relays, collapsing conduits, and machine spirits lashing out in techno-sacramental rage. Despite this, they recorded the event with a kind of severe admiration. For them, the siege was an engineering crucible that revealed the limits of Terra's ancient mechanisms and the inefficiencies born from centuries of ritual stagnation. Logistical analytics from the Mechanicus paint an even more detailed picture. They recorded the precise rate at which ammunition stores were depleted, noting that the walls of the Imperial Palace consumed munitions at nearly triple the output projected in the baseline palace defense protocols. Their analysis confirms that the traitor bombardments exceeded expected potency by a factor of 4, especially during the initial phases when orbital guns rained fire with a precision only possible through combined Legion command. Defensive void shields, though reinforced repeatedly by entire cohorts of engine seers, experienced progressive degradation that could not be countered through traditional maintenance cycles. Instead, the Mechanicus were forced to fragment their forge cohorts into micro-teams capable of repairing shield emitters while under direct fire, a practice that would normally be forbidden due to the high probability of reactor bleed or spirit wrath. Yet this improvised system not only kept the shields functioning, it introduced a temporary efficiency model later replicated in several post-heresy fortification protocols. Both institutions knew that the siege was too large for standard models, but their approaches diverged sharply. The Administratum viewed the survival of Terra as a function of resource allocation. Bodies to the walls, reserves to the breach points, material routed to where defensive collapse seemed imminent. They recorded the siege as a matter of numbers. How many shells were fired, how many defenders were rotated, how many days each district held before falling. The Mechanicus perceived it instead as a planetary scale system stress test. Their data emphasized flow rates, energy throughput, reactor tolerances, shield harmonics, and the exact minute-by-minute endurance of the palace's internal infrastructure. Administratum projections often ended with margins of error reaching 20% or higher. Mechanicus analytics, while not immune to disruption, maintained far tighter variance due to direct machine-spirit interfacing. A key point of agreement between the two institutions concerns the catastrophic strain placed on the transport grid. Administratum couriers and Mechanicus conveyor rights report that the palace's internal transit tunnels, a labyrinth carved through layers of bedrock, became choked with rerouted supply convoys. Entire zones designated for population movement were converted into ammunition arteries, causing severe internal congestion and forcing defenders in some regions to go without resupply for hours longer than planned. The Mechanicus calculated that almost 1/3 of all transport delays during the siege stemmed from breakdowns in the cargo lift network. Administratum audits later confirmed this, noting that the majority of these failures originated from overuse long before the siege even began, evidence of structural fatigue left unaddressed due to bureaucratic prioritization of ceremonial projects. Another combined finding emerges from how both groups handled data integrity. Administratum scribes documented the precise moment when their archival redundancy systems failed under pressure, causing entire segments of historical records to become fragmented. Meanwhile, the Mechanicus recorded the exact pathways through which corrupted battle telemetry propagated through palace systems, forcing tech priests to isolate entire cogitator stacks to prevent widespread data collapse. Despite these losses, their collaborative reconstruction efforts after the siege allowed for the creation of one of the most detailed operational archives in Imperial history, though both sides acknowledge that certain gaps will never be filled. By the midpoint of the siege, the Administratum and Mechanicus had formed a reluctant but functional symbiosis. Administratum officers provided priority route authorizations, while Mechanicus cohorts offered real-time adjustments to logistical predictions based on machine feedback rather than bureaucratic timing. This fusion of human oversight and mechanical precision stabilized the palace's defense strategy and allowed for rapid redeployment of troops during critical breach attempts. Their final impression of the event, documented independently but aligned in theme, is that Terra's survival depended not on any single heroic act, but on the ability of two massive, rigid institutions to abandon their usual pace and operate in a state of sustained crisis without collapsing inward. If the Siege of Terra revealed anything to these two ancient arms of the Imperium, it was that the machinery of governance and the machinery of industry were capable of operating at extreme intensities, provided they were forced into alignment by existential threat. In their concluding analyses, both institutions agree that Terra endured not because the systems were flawless, but because they were vast enough to absorb catastrophic damage while still maintaining a baseline of operational function. The siege became a metric, a case study, and a warning. It demonstrated exactly how close the Imperium came to systemic failure, and precisely how much strain its infrastructure can bear before breaking. The technical archives of the Adeptus Mechanicus and the post-siege compilations of the Administratum identify several engagements within the broader Siege of Terra as operational benchmarks, not because of their symbolic weight, but because they revealed measurable shifts in both Loyalist and Traitor fighting methods. These battles were dissected for patterns, stress behaviors of defensive lines, failure rates of armor under specific weapon types, and the combat logic displayed by Legions Astartes on both sides. Rather than narrate them as heroic clashes, the data keepers treated each engagement as a sequence of variables, tracking how forces adapted or degraded under sustained assault. By doing so, the Mechanicus sought to understand the true mechanical nature of war during the siege, while the Administratum attempted to quantify the rate of attrition to predict how long Terra could remain viable. One of the earliest engagements dissected in these records is the fighting along the Mercury Exultant kill zone. Mechanicus analysis describes this area as a pressure corridor intentionally shaped to funnel enemy forces into predictable kill lanes. The battle became a proving ground for the Traitor's new favoured pattern: massed armoured spearheads layered with infantry waves driven forward in tight synchronization. Administratum auditors observed that the Death Guard's approach relied on sustained momentum, using biological resilience to soak defensive fire long enough for Sons of Horus and World Eater formations to exploit gaps with sudden shock assaults. The Loyalists countered with overlapping fields of thermal and macrobolter fire, yet the Mechanicus noted that ammunition expenditure exceeded projections by nearly 70% due to the Traitor's refusal to break formation. This battle would later be used as a case study demonstrating that predictable enemy movement, while easier to target, can still exhaust defensive supply rates when the attackers possess Legion-level endurance. Another engagement that received extensive study is the defensive fighting around the Saturnine Gate. Administratum scribes documented this battle primarily as a logistical failure narrowly averted. Their projections show that had Korax pattern reinforcement squads not arrived at the exact hour they did, the gate's interior infantry reserves would have collapsed from overextension. Mechanicus observers, meanwhile, focused on the traitor force's precision in selecting weak points. Their records highlight how the Emperor's children deployed sonic weaponry in ways designed specifically to destabilize the structural latticework of the outer wall, not merely to kill defenders. This tactic caused highly localized vibrations that amplified internal stress fractures, threatening shield emitters critical to the entirety of the palace's western defensive grid. The Loyalist response, deploying legionaries trained in rapid counter-assault patterns, demonstrated a contrasting doctrine. Agile, small-scale shock responses deployed directly into breach points, prioritizing mobility and compartmentalization rather than static resistance. The interplay between the measured cruelty of the Emperor's children and the calculated mobility of Loyalist responders formed a technical profile that the Mechanicus later labelled a microtheatre of urban war efficiency. The fighting within the Helios Gate Undercroft became another focal point for Mechanicus combat analysis. This battle is described in their archives as an environmental war rather than a positional one. The Undercroft's labyrinth of tunnels, machine vaults, and regulator chambers forced both sides to adapt their fighting styles to extreme close-quarters conditions. Administratum casualty logs indicate that nearly half of all fatalities in this region occurred at ranges of less than 10 meters, with many engagements devolving into blind exchanges of fire across choked corridors. Mechanicus data shows that plasma weapons were disadvantaged due to overheating risks, while melters proved disproportionately effective at collapsing connector tunnels and redirecting traitor advances. The Sons of Horus entered these chambers with a direct assault doctrine, clearing space with aggressive flamer sweeps, whereas Loyalist defenders, frequently drawn from Imperial Fists and associated auxilia cohorts, preferred a modular fallback method. They used narrow choke points to bleed attrition from advancing squads, retreating only when essential, and always toward pre-mapped firing nests. This encounter illustrated the extremes of Legion adaptability, one side maximising shock aggression, the other maximising structural advantage. Further along the palace exterior, the battle recorded as the Solar Promenade advance became proof of how traitor legions altered their doctrines to counter the palace's defensive geometry. Administratum reports describe this promenade as a wide, sloping approach with excellent lines of sight for defenders. Under normal parameters, any ascending force should have been shredded by heavy emplacement fire. Instead, Mechanicus logs reveal that the Iron Warriors utilized a rotating shield wall formation supported by demonically augmented artillery pieces. These war engines absorbed significant portions of incoming fire, acting as moving fortifications that shielded their infantry long enough to establish temporary forward redoubts. This use of modular fortification tactics, combined with the Iron Warriors' propensity for coordinated saturation bombardment, forced Loyalist defenders to abandon predictable firing patterns. They shifted from synchronized volleys to staggered precision shots aimed at destabilizing the moving barricades. The record emphasizes that this battle exemplified the traitor's ability to hybridize mortal engineering with warp-tainted technology, creating attack vectors that conventional Imperial analysis could barely model. Within the palace interior, the engagements near the Eternity Wall pylons created another data-dense archive for both institutions. These pylons formed part of the palace's exoskeletal stabilizer network, making them a structural priority. The traitor attempt to breach these supports was carried out with a dual approach. Shock troops from the World Eaters charging in brute force waves, followed by methodical assault formations from the Sons of Horus, equipped with breaching charges meant to detonate at specific structural frequencies. Mechanicus combat scribe footage from surviving servo skulls shows the Loyalists responding with infantry killbox formations designed to leverage verticality. Defenders used elevated positions to create crisscrossing arcs of bolter fire, exploiting the narrow angles between the pylons to maximize crossfire lethality. Administratum injury logs identify these engagements as among the most intense of the siege due to the relentless nature of the attackers. Fighting style analysis notes that while the Loyalists favoured structured fire discipline, the traitors employed a tempo-based assault pattern that alternated between berserker frenzy and precise, targeted demolition. The battle around the Lion's Gate spaceport provides perhaps the clearest example of how shifting battlefield conditions reshaped combat doctrines in real time. Administratum projections show that the spaceport was essential for any hope of reinforcement, making it a primary traitor target. Mechanicus telemetries document how the port's defense grid strained under continuous bombardment, eventually failing at several nodes. When the traitors breached the outer perimeter, they advanced using a mixed armor column composed of land raiders, Spartan assault tanks, and warp-corrupted engines whose movement patterns defied standard traction models. The Loyalists countered with a defensive strategy centered around elevation control and forced bottlenecking. Records show that Imperial Fists heavy weapon cadres executed firing solutions with near-zero variance, striking at the joints and treads of traitor armor to immobilize vehicles instead of destroying them outright. Immobilized war machines became temporary obstacles that disrupted traitor advance timing, buying Loyalist units enough moments to reposition. Mechanicus evaluators later categorized this battle as a strategic demonstration of intentional battlefield shaping, where destruction was secondary to manipulating enemy spatial flow. Smaller, localized incidents also provided significant combat insight. For example, the so-called Firehold breach was not a grand confrontation, but a compact engagement where Salamander's units held a thermal regulator junction against repeated demon engine incursions. Mechanicus logs emphasize how the Salamanders modified their fire patterns to conserve ammunition, using environmental temperature spikes to their advantage. Administratum scribes noted that the defenders maintained position far longer than predicted, largely due to measured fire discipline and intimate understanding of heat-based weapon performance in enclosed spaces. The fighting style here contrasted sharply with the larger battles. Instead of broad tactical maneuvers, the record shows minute adjustments in stance, aim, and timing from both sides, turning the encounter into a granular example of precision-driven endurance. Across all of these engagements, the Mechanicus and Administratum present a shared conclusion regarding fighting styles. Loyalist defenders consistently favoured structured, layered defence, using predictable patterns to maintain cohesion, compensate for manpower shortages, and preserve ammunition. Their combat logic leaned towards sustainability, emphasising positional advantage, measured counter-assaults, and exploiting terrain. Traitor Legions, by contrast, embraced hyper-aggressive assault doctrines that leveraged the shock value of Legion-scale momentum combined with the unpredictable distortions granted by warp influence. Their approach sought to overload defenders with simultaneous threats, forcing them to abandon optimal formations in favour of urgent reactive manoeuvres. These competing styles generated a chaotic equilibrium where neither side could fully dominate, but where each battle exposed new weaknesses for the archives to document. Through every recorded war zone within the Siege of Terra, the battle data reveals a consistent pattern. The siege was not a single continuous doctrine, but an ever-evolving exchange of adaptations. Each clash forced recalculations, invalidated assumptions, and reshaped how both sides understood the limits of their own tactics. The Administratum captured the human cost and logistical strain. The Mechanicus captured the mechanical, structural, and technological behaviours. Together, these records form a composite analysis showing the siege not merely as a defensive war, but as a long grinding process in which fighting styles mutated under pressure and battlefield patterns became lessons for future generations of war planners. The data repositories of the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus include several smaller but still essential records that occurred parallel to the larger engagements of the Siege of Terra. These incidents, though not elevated to the prominence of the main battles, provided supplementary insight into how both sides adapted to deteriorating conditions. Many of these conflicts unfolded outside the primary palace walls, in lesser-known sectors of Terra that rarely draw attention in public accounts, but feature heavily in the technical and bureaucratic archives. They were catalogued not for symbolic value, but for the operational patterns they revealed and the variables they introduced into the final logistical assessments. One such incident is the conflict later designated the Selenet Ridge Exchange. Administratum Logicians classified it as a non-primary engagement, yet the battle's placement near several atmospheric regulator spires made it strategically noteworthy. The traitor forces deployed a composite force of artillery-equipped infantry, supported by demonically influenced mortar constructs. Their bombardment targeted the regulator foundations with the intention of destabilizing the pressure systems feeding into northern palace districts. Mechanicus observers recorded irregular detonation patterns in the traitor artillery, noting a deviation between firing impulses and projected trajectories. This caused overlapping shockwaves that complicated Loyalist response patterns. The defenders, mostly composed of Solar Auxilia cadres reinforced by elements of the Blood Angels, used controlled counter-battery fire guided by cogitator-assisted triangulation. The incident demonstrated how both sides had begun incorporating feedback from earlier failures into their evolving battle doctrines, shifting from broad force assaults to more targeted infrastructure strikes. Another engagement of interest unfolded around the Kyber Gate habitation complexes, an area heavily populated before the siege and later abandoned in stages as civilians fled toward palace shelters. Administratum records contain detailed maps of population flow, emergency evacuations, and survivor trajectories, providing a dense picture of how the battlefield shifted as the gate zone became depopulated. The traitor presence came largely from fragmented word-bearer warbands attempting to secure a corridor toward the inner walls. They enacted ritualized destruction patterns that Mechanicus analysts classified as irrational in purely tactical terms, yet responsible for destabilizing multiple multi-story structures due to their selection of load-bearing points. The Loyalist resistance was thin at first, composed of remnant militia groups and dispersed Astartes squads, operating without Legion-level coordination. Fighting in this sector became a study in improvised defense, where small pockets of resistance delayed word-bearer advances through rapid relocation, short ambush cycles, and controlled demolition of compromised buildings. Administratum calculators later concluded that these improvised tactics delayed the traitors long enough to prevent a direct breach of Northern Palace approaches, creating a measurable benefit despite the lack of formal command cohesion. Another recorded conflict, known in the Mechanicus logs as the Arc-Blind Severance, took place within a partially sunken transit grid running beneath the Southern Palace district. This grid housed numerous power line junctions essential for maintaining the integrity of several defense turrets. When a traitor force composed of Iron Warriors siege specialists attempted to cut through the grid to disable these nodes, the fighting that followed transformed the location into a confined arena where both sides faced restricted movement. The Iron Warriors relied on breaching drills and seismic charges designed to open pathways through collapsed tunnels. Loyalist units, primarily Imperial Fists and supporting Mechanicus Scitari, responded by using choke points created by the grid's curved architecture. The exchange highlighted the traitors' preference for tools of forced entry and rapid demolition, contrasted with Loyalist reliance on spatial awareness and deliberate control of angles. Although the defenders eventually withdrew due to damage accumulation, their delay forced the traitors to reroute their advance, ultimately slowing the broader push against the southern turrets by several hours. Another engagement often overlooked in broader narratives is the confrontation across the coastal districts near the Pan-Pacific Shelf. This area consisted of vast ruins, partially submerged transit lanes, and the remnants of old manufactoria complexes. Administratum oceanographic teams recorded irregular tidal surges influenced by bombardment shock waves, altering terrain conditions multiple times per hour. Traitor forces attempting to exploit these shifting conditions utilized fast-moving infantry elements supported by light walkers, capable of retaining stability on unstable surfaces. Loyalist forces deployed a mix of White Scars detachments and hover platform units from the Mechanicum Tugmata. The resulting battle demonstrated tactical flexibility from both sides, with Loyalists relying on mobility granted by rapid lift vehicles, while the traitors attempted to isolate defenders through swift encirclement maneuvers. Mechanicus analysts noted unusual stress accumulation in several coastal infrastructure remnants, leading to unpredictable collapses that altered engagement lines without direct interference from either side. These environmental factors forced both Loyalists and traitors to adjust combat patterns frequently, turning the battle into a demonstration of adaptive microstrategy rather than raw firepower. Smaller but still relevant engagements occurred within the orbital infrastructure surrounding Terra. Though most stations had been neutralized or captured before the final stages of the siege, a few remained contested zones where desperate skirmishes unfolded. One such confrontation occurred aboard the crippled defense ring designated Bastion 0.4. Administratum records indicate that a mixed Loyalist force, including army specialists and a handful of Astartes survivors, attempted to maintain partial control of the ring's defense grid. Mechanicus data reflects that power fluctuations rendered the station unreliable for sustained orbital defense, yet both sides fought over it due to its proximity and potential as a drop zone control point. Traitor boarding units relied heavily on corridor domination tactics and rapid breach charges, while Loyalist defenders attempted to isolate them through pressure door manipulations and targeted decompression cycles. This conflict contributed little to the outcome of the siege, but provided an instructive example of combat under compromised technological conditions, which the Mechanicus later used for failure mode analyses of orbital ring systems. The aftermath assessments conducted after the Siege of Terra reveal how these additional engagements, though overshadowed by the major battles, contributed cumulatively to the strategic landscape. Administratum casualty projections show that small-scale engagements accounted for a disproportionately high share of localized losses, especially among auxiliary troops. They attribute this to the fragmented and improvised nature of these fights, where defenders lacked the structured support of the main palace fortifications. Mechanicus surveys of post-engagement zones demonstrate that infrastructure damage accumulated faster in these outer districts due to the traitors' increasingly targeted strikes against energy lines, pressure regulators, and transit conduits. These smaller destructions did not individually threaten Terra's survival, but their combined effect forced continuous logistical rerouting that strained supply networks already pushed beyond their intended capacities. In evaluating the siege's final logistical state, the Administratum concluded that Terra's defensive endurance fell below sustainable levels near the final stages. Their calculations show that if the traitor advance had continued uninterrupted for several more days, multiple palace sectors would have lost access to coordinated resupply. Essential defensive emplacements would have faced ammunition scarcity, leading to a measurable decline in the effectiveness of perimeter fire. They note that the survival of key sectors depended heavily on the ability of defenders to adapt to rapid changes, patch damaged infrastructure, and reorganize under pressure. Meanwhile, Mechanicus data from post-battle analysis indicates a substantial depletion of functioning machinery, with many weapons and defensive systems pushed beyond recommended operating cycles. Power grids experienced cascading failures, and numerous structural subsystems operated at emergency tolerances. In their final combined analysis, the Administratum and Mechanicus present a unified conclusion. The Siege of Terra was sustained through a combination of strategic delay, controlled withdrawals, and localized acts of resistance that cumulatively slowed the traitor advance long enough for critical developments elsewhere to shape the final outcome. They emphasize that while the primary battles drew most attention, the aggregate impact of these secondary engagements was essential. They disrupted enemy logistics, forced redeployments, altered advance timings, and created pockets of resistance that absorbed traitor manpower far beyond initial projections. The Mechanicus frames the siege as a demonstration of how war becomes a system under collapse, where the mechanics of defense shift from orderly doctrine to continuous adaptation, governed by deteriorating infrastructure unpredictable environmental change, and partial technological failure. The Administratum frames the siege as a case study in survival through statistical improbability, where projected defeat was repeatedly postponed by unplanned events, unstructured resistance, and individual sectors holding longer than expected. Together, their records describe the siege not as a singular catastrophic moment, but as a protracted sequence of interlocking pressures where every minor battle and every fragment of resistance contributed to Terra's endurance. The Inquisition's collected impressions of the Siege of Terra differ from the accounts preserved by other institutions, not because the foundational events change, but because the emphasis shifts from chronology and logistics toward the irregularities woven into the conflict. Their records were compiled after the fact once it became clear the Imperium would survive the immediate catastrophe. These documents reflect an analytical posture shaped by suspicion rather than awe. The Inquisition approached the siege as a phenomenon requiring dissection, noting not only what happened but also what resisted explanation. Their archives often dwell on deviations from projected outcomes, environmental irregularities, undocumented presences, and fragments of testimony that do not conform to the conventional retellings of the final battles. Their earliest impressions center on patterns of psychic disturbance that spread across Terra long before the traitor vanguard reached the planet's outskirts. These disturbances were noted by several sanctioned psychers who described fluctuations in psychic density, unlike the rising pressure usually associated with large-scale warp activity. The phenomenon manifested as intermittent surges that increased and decreased without clear pattern, at times expanding across entire continents and at other times collapsing into localized pockets. The Inquisition's internal analysts remark that these fluctuations did not match the standard signatures of warp entities or known sorcerous rituals. They suggest that the scale of the Emperor's psychic exertion, combined with the presence of multiple primarchs gathering near the Imperial Palace, may have introduced distortions that regular psychers could perceive but not interpret. The phenomenon was recorded only through witness accounts, as no reliable instrumentation existed to quantify its magnitude. The Inquisition also noted irregularities in communication data, not related to technological interference alone. Vox channels across multiple frequencies experienced disruptions that could not be traced to enemy jamming or material damage. Some of these interruptions manifested as static that contained discernible patterns, which analysts later identified as partial reflections of legitimate transmissions. In simple terms, some Vox messages appear to echo before the original message was sent, as though information was being mirrored and displaced by a temporal distortion. While this could not be verified through controlled testing, the Inquisition marked such events as potential byproducts of warp interference associated with the traitor fleet's approach. Their documentation describes the effect as a temporary fracturing of causality within narrow communication bands, though the exact mechanism remains unproven. Survey teams operating near the initial outer defences submitted reports containing descriptions of figures moving through the ruins ahead of both Loyalist and traitor forces. Some accounts refer to individuals wearing advanced armour with unfamiliar iconography. Others mention unidentifiable constructs that moved silently across terrain despite the absence of power signatures. None of these sightings were corroborated by physical evidence, and no casualties were attributed to these entities. The Inquisition classified these reports as unconfirmed but noteworthy, noting that the Siege of Terra created conditions where multiple factions, including those with no open alignment, might have observed the unfolding conflict without intervening. They also entertained the possibility of warp phantoms or hallucinations induced by prolonged exposure to psychic pressure, though the diversity of the sightings challenges a single organism explanation. Another irregular observation concerns the behavior of certain traitor vessels during the transition into Terra's orbit. Administratum projections documented expected orbital descent patterns for the traitor fleet. However, several ships deviated sharply from these predictions, changing course with precision that contradicted the extensive damage visible on their hulls. Inquisition analysts noted that some vessels continued to maneuver even after losing structural stability, suggesting external forces influenced their trajectories. While the Mechanicus attributes these movements to final surges of emergency power or remnant momentum, the Inquisition flagged them as indicative of non-mechanical control. They point out that certain shifts corresponded with recorded spikes in warp activity, though the correlation is not sufficient to confirm direct causation. Within the early stages of the siege, multiple testimonies from palace defense personnel describe sensations of displacement while occupying static positions. Several individuals reported memories that did not align with their confirmed locations, claiming they had briefly perceived alternate versions of the same battlefield. These recollections include altered enemy positions, different structural damage patterns, and variations in environmental conditions such as light levels and atmospheric density. The Inquisition recorded these incidents carefully, acknowledging that they could have arisen from exhaustion, trauma, or psychic contamination. Yet the repeated consistency of certain details across unrelated witnesses prevented full dismissal of the phenomenon. Their analysts concluded that during the siege the boundaries between potential futures may have thinned, allowing fragments of unrealized outcomes to imprint onto human perception. In the Central Palace District, specific engagement zones were marked by temperature variances that had no atmospheric explanation. Certain hallways and chambers experienced sudden drops in temperature even when fully sealed from outside air. Mechanicus sensors recorded the changes, ruling out mechanical malfunction. The Inquisition noted that these cold zones often coincided with locations heavily affected by psychic conflict, including areas where Thousand Suns operated. However, similar fluctuations were recorded in sites with no confirmed traitor sorcerer presence, complicating attempts to categorize the phenomenon. Some Inquisition scholars suggested that the cold zones represented local disruptions in material stability caused by warp resonance, though no definitive model exists to support this. Another element that attracted Inquisition scrutiny was the persistence of anomalous inscriptions discovered on several palace walls during the later phases of the siege. These markings were not created by Loyalist forces or any known traitor faction. They appeared as shallow etchings that formed complex geometric shapes lacking clear symbolism or linguistic structure. Attempts to trace their origin yielded no results. Some investigators proposed they might have been caused by weapons fire leaving irregular impact scars, yet their symmetry and spacing argued against accidental formation. The Inquisition archived them as cryptic environmental artifacts without known significance, noting their placement near areas where psychic surges had been most intense. During the final approach of the Traitor Legions toward the inner palace, several psychers stationed within secure vaults reported auditory impressions not sourced through ordinary means. These were not coherent voices, but structured harmonics that resembled layered commands, as though multiple streams of intent were colliding and producing acoustic residue. The psychers could not translate the impressions into words, and none of them shared identical interpretations of the harmonics. The Inquisition labelled the phenomenon as a psychic resonance effect produced by the immense concentration of warp entities. They also noted that the harmonics intensified just prior to major assaults, though again this correlation remained insufficient for predictive use. A final category of observations centred on the unexplained survival of certain defensive points that should have collapsed according to administratum projections. Some defensive lines overwhelmed on multiple fronts continue to operate despite the absence of recorded reinforcements or supply deliveries. In other cases, defenders reported receiving support from unidentified combatants who appeared momentarily and then vanished without trace. These interventions may have been misidentifications of Loyalist units, maneuvering rapidly under stress, but the documented locations and timings conflict with established troop movements. The Inquisition did not attempt to explain these accounts conclusively. Instead, they noted that during the Siege of Terra, the density of conflict and the magnitude of psychic saturation created a battlefield where not every action could be reliably tracked or verified. In synthesizing these impressions, the Inquisition concluded that the Siege of Terra did not simply represent a physical battle, but a convergence of psychic, temporal, and environmental anomalies triggered by the presence of the Emperor, the Primarchs, and the Traitor Legions. They recognized that many recorded irregularities could be attributed to stress, corrupted memories, or incomplete data. However, they maintained that a portion of the anomalies stemmed from interactions between the material world and the warp that exceeded established understanding. Their archives do not attempt to impose definitive explanations, focusing instead on documenting the events as they were perceived, preserving evidence of the deviations that shaped the siege's atmosphere. The deeper the archival teams moved into the records of the Siege of Terra, the more evident it became that several patterns defied conventional logistical or tactical interpretation. These elements persisted not because the events were insufficiently recorded, but because their nature resisted alignment with any known strategic model. Some of these discrepancies originated from the enemy's use of warp-based distortions and demonic interference, yet others emerged from Loyalist operations, where precision and discipline should have prevented any ambiguity. The Inquisition's compilation of these anomalies was not intended to challenge the established chronology of the siege, but to isolate irregularities that offered insight into how the conflict unfolded beneath the visible structure of battle reports. One of the most persistent anomalies appeared in the overlapping accounts of the fighting around the Ascension spires during the later stages of the assault. Standard record-keeping captured the presence of multiple Loyalist detachments, sustaining holding actions against Traitor Astartes forces. However, several pick captures retrieved after the event showed duplicate squad formations in positions that could not be reconciled with their confirmed deployment logs. The initial assumption was that these images represented corrupted data, or the presence of enemy forces employing mimicry, yet no known Chaos warband in that region utilized such deception. The phenomenon was tentatively attributed to warp interference, though the timed intervals of the captures did not correlate with warp surges recorded by Mechanicus Auspex installations. Another irregularity involved the sustained defensive actions within the Plasteel Concourse beneath the Imperial Palace's southwestern transit arteries. Multiple Imperial Army companies reported reinforcement by unidentified power-armoured individuals who possessed no heraldry, no chapter iconography, and no markings that matched extant Loyalist legions. Their armour presented as standardised but lacked the distinguishing wear expected from combat usage. These individuals neither communicated nor remained present for formal debriefing. Their intervention was recorded in several mutually corroborating after-action logs, yet no biological, material, or atmospheric trace remained once the fighting had concluded. Subsequent inquisitorial reviews classified these entities as potential warp manifestations shaped by extreme psychoreactive conditions, though their tactical coherence challenged this explanation. Further inconsistencies appeared in the casualty records of multiple zones, where Loyalist forces were confirmed to have been annihilated during overwhelming assaults. In specific sectors, notably the fractured lower terraces of the Eternity Wall, biometric scans performed weeks after the siege concluded indicated trace signatures of individuals previously confirmed as killed in action. These traces were faint and non-functional, yet they corresponded to exact genomic markers of the missing personnel. No remains were found. The assumption of vaporization was not viable, as structural analysis showed insufficient thermal activity to account for the total absence of organic matter. These irregular readings were sealed at the time and assigned to the category of unresolved battlefield anomalies. The Inquisition also identified a small number of sealed reports describing irregular time dilation effects encountered during the most intense phases of demon-driven conflict. Several survivors recounted experiences in which entire segments of combat unfolded in perceived fragments or delayed sequences. These subjective distortions were initially dismissed as psychological stress responses. However, Auspex logs from at least 2 Adeptus Custodes monitoring stations registered temporal inconsistencies within narrow radii, suggesting that the nature of the siege's most violent engagements produced localized instability. This instability did not alter the outcome of any recorded conflict, but it introduced interpretive complexities into the chronology that required selective redaction to preserve clarity across official accounts. A more troubling category of anomalies emerged from sealed Mechanicus cipher threads recovered after the war. These threads indicated instances where machine spirits embedded in major defense platforms behaved in a manner inconsistent with their technical limitations. Some systems appeared to activate without power routing, while others recorded target solutions before sensor arrays returned complete data. The Mechanicus classified these as battlefield miracles or unexplained machine awakenings, designations intended to avoid conflict with the established principles of the cult Mechanicus. The Inquisition took a more cautious stance, categorizing these occurrences as possible warp-adjacent phenomena or as evidence of undocumented pre-imperial technology integrated into the palace network. The most heavily sealed encounter involved the apparent disappearance and reappearance of an entire traitor assault cohort during the final advance toward the Saturnine Gate. Ultrasonic scans recorded their approach, supported by thermal readings and seismic detection. Yet the physical signatures vanished within an interval far too short to support retreat or redeployment. The cohort reappeared approximately 80 seconds later, emerging from an angle inconsistent with their prior vector. They launched an immediate attack, but with reduced coordination and measurable disruptions in their biometric rhythms. Although the phenomenon was attributed to the warp, the Inquisition noted that demonic entities were not detected in the area during that period. The sealed nature of this report suggests concern that the event may have represented an experimental deployment of enemy technology or a form of psycho-driven transit not previously documented. Taken collectively, these anomalies do not undermine the established understanding of the Siege of Terra. Instead, they illustrate the degree to which the conflict's intensity and warp-saturated environment allowed deviations from conventional military patterns. The Inquisition's purpose in cataloguing these irregularities was not to claim hidden truths, but to ensure that the record acknowledged the presence of elements that defied straightforward classification. Each anomaly remained sealed not to suppress historical accuracy, but to prevent the proliferation of theories lacking foundation in proven fact. The siege was already defined by extremes of strategy, sacrifice, and devastation. Introducing unresolved irregularities into general circulation would risk distorting its already complex narrative. The sealed reports therefore persist as controlled entries within the archive, accessible only to those whose responsibilities require awareness of the siege's most ambiguous components. The final classified files pertaining to the Siege of Terra carry a different weight from the earlier compilations. They were assembled not to preserve a public record, nor to reinforce the established sequence of the war, but to provide the Inquisition with a reference set that could survive internal scrutiny, even after centuries of re-evaluation. These documents were filtered through multiple layers of clearance, encrypted in separate data vaults, and intentionally segmented to prevent any single individual from accessing the full structure of the archive without explicit authorization from several distinct branches of the Ordos. Their contents did not alter the known outcome of the siege, yet they revealed complexities that resisted inclusion within the main historical corpus. Many of these classified entries originate from the custodian command blocks, assigned to monitor internal disturbances within the palace. These reports were rarely mentioned outside restricted circles because they involved incidents that could not be connected to identifiable opponents. Several instances describe spatial intrusions that left no trace of forced entry, no energy signature indicating teleportation, and no known marks of conventional demonic manifestation. Personnel in the vicinity reported sudden shifts in atmospheric pressure, faint auditory distortions, and a sensation of spatial compression. No casualties were recorded in these events, yet the absence of any clear cause or footprint compelled the Custodes to classify them as anomalies requiring long-term surveillance rather than battlefield irregularities. Other sealed files documented conflicts that occurred entirely within the palace's substructural labyrinths, where thousands of kilometers of reinforced tunnels housed generators, data conduits, and long-abandoned maintenance passages. Some records recount engagements where security teams discovered remnants of fighting that left no corresponding entries from Loyalist or Traitor forces. Scorched plating, discharged ammunition, and signs of close quarters, struggle appeared in areas where no human or transhuman fighters were confirmed to have passed. These events were filed under unaffiliated hostiles, though the absence of bodies or identifiable signatures left their origin unresolved. The Inquisition preserved these files because of their potential connection to similar irregularities encountered in later millennia, suggesting a pattern rather than isolated incidents. Further classified content centers around psyker interference recorded during the final hours before the traitors breached the outer palace gates. A small number of astropathic relays transmitted fragmented warnings that did not correspond to battlefield conditions. They described presences moving through the palace in ways that bypassed both physical and psychic detection. These warnings were not considered reliable during the siege itself, yet analysis conducted centuries later revealed that several of them aligned with unexplained fluctuations detected by Mechanicus Auspex arrays. The content remained sealed due to the lack of any confirmed origin for these signatures. No known entity, Imperial, Traitor, or Warp generated matches the transmission patterns. One of the most heavily restricted entries concerns a custodian patrol that reported visual contact with an unidentified figure deep within the Hall of Runes. The witness statements describe a silhouette resembling Astartes' proportions, yet lacking identifiable armor structure. The figure appeared briefly at the edge of the patrol's lumen perimeter before receding without triggering motion sensors or energy scans. A sweep of the area returned no trace of any presence. While some later analysts dismissed the account as a stress-induced misperception, the custodians involved were recorded as highly stable, disciplined individuals operating far below threshold fatigue. The file remains sealed because of the potential implications surrounding an unknown entity operating undetected within the innermost defensive zones of the Imperial Palace. The Inquisition's final assessment files use these anomalies not to challenge the overarching narrative of the siege, but to contextualize the level of distortion produced when the warp and material space strain against one another. The siege represented a convergence of psychic pressure, technological extremity, and unprecedented strategic density. In such conditions, irregularities were inevitable. The Inquisition noted that the presence of classified cases did not diminish the clarity of the siege's outcome. Instead, they emphasized that even the most rigorously documented conflicts contain layers that resist complete resolution. These files serve as reminders that historical certainty is often a construct of necessity, assembled to provide coherence to events that, in their raw state, were far more fragmented. The final thoughts contained within the Inquisition's closing memorandum adopt a tone of analytical neutrality rather than speculation. The Siege of Terra was defined by its visibility, vast armies, monumental defences and outcomes that shaped every subsequent age of the Imperium. Yet beneath that visible structure was a set of hidden variables that did not alter the course of the war but revealed the limits of perception under conditions of extreme existential pressure. The Inquisition concluded that these concealed elements were not errors or gaps, but inherent consequences of the environment in which the siege occurred. The warp-saturated atmosphere, the density of psychic trauma, and the unprecedented concentration of metahuman and demonic entities created a landscape in which certain data points would inevitably fall outside predictable boundaries. In its final analysis, the Inquisition did not label these unresolved elements as threats. Instead, they were designated as markers of the siege's true depth. They indicated that even in the presence of overwhelming documentation and near unbroken chronologies, the event contained strata that could only be acknowledged, not fully understood. The classified files therefore remain preserved not to hint at hidden truths behind the siege, but to ensure that those responsible for safeguarding the Imperium understand that moments of extreme historical weight often produce distortions that defy absolute explanation.